So we've been dealing with solving or showing triangles that are congruent by one of the four theorems or postulates. You're going to continue to use triangles throughout the rest of this chapter. And on section 4.4, we're going to show that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So you need to know abbreviation, CPCTC. And I have to tell you a little story. When I was in geometry in high school, my geometry teacher would take a meter stick and pound it on the ground and chant that acronym so that it was pounded into our heads. So if you hear me chanting it like an acronym, such as CPCTC, there's a reason for it, and that's the story behind it. So this acronym stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So you may want to write that down at the top of your note-taking guide because that's the acronym we're going to use when we start doing these proofs in this note-taking guide. Alright, let's take a look at the first example. So it says, I'm given angle KBC is congruent to ACB, and I'm also given K is congruent to A. So I wrote that down in my given, right? So then my next step is I'm trying to find something that I know either from the picture or from what they gave me. Well, what they gave me is pretty straightforward. There's nothing else I could go off of. The first thing I see is automatically I'm seeing BC as a side shared between these two triangles. So BC would be a side that's congruent on both of those triangles. So the next step I would want to write down is that BC is congruent to itself, and the reason for that is reflexive property. Now I might see, oh, well now I have an angle and a side. Well, now I can say these two triangles are congruent to each other by angle, angle, side. Now remember, when we set up our congruency statement, we have to make sure our angles match up. So angle B matches with angle C, K matches with A, and then C matches with B. Alright, remember I'm trying to show that these sides are congruent to each other. Well, if my triangles are congruent to each other, then I'm going to know corresponding parts of those triangles are going to be congruent to each other. So my last step would just be, well, if KB is congruent to AC, I know that because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So this acronym, rather than writing it out as a statement, you can just write CPCTC. Okay, let's take a look at the next one here. And since it's a got it question, I'm going to have you try that proof and see if you can come up with how to show C and E are congruent. Okay, so the first step is writing down your given. So they already marked it on my picture, so I don't have to do that part, and then that should be the first thing you wrote down. The next thing is, do I know anything else from my picture? Do I know anything else that is congruent? Yeah, I know that angle CAB is congruent to angle EAD because those are vertical angles. So I would say those two angles are congruent by vertical angles theorem. Next thing I would look at is, okay, now what do I have? Well, I have a side, an angle, and a side. Well, now I know that those two triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. So that would be the next thing that I would write down. Remember, I'm trying to show C is congruent to E, and those are corresponding angles, so I can just jump to that conclusion, and my reason again is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, so CPCTC. Okay, I have one more proof that's on the back, and this one's pretty lengthy, but I just wanted to show it to you so that you can just see it and be aware of it. So I have given that AB is congruent to AC, and they already marked that, and then I also know that M is the midpoint of BC. So again, I always look at my triangle. Is there anything I know that's congruent based off my triangles? And in this case, no. But I do know from the given that M is a midpoint. So as soon as they tell me that M is a midpoint, I'm going to know it's going to bisect this segment into two congruent segments. So I'm going to write down that BM is going to be congruent to MC and that's going to be by my definition of a midpoint. Now, I'm looking to see, is there anything else congruent? Well, earlier we said no, but we could have also wrote down that AM is congruent to itself because that side shares between the two smaller triangles. So you could have said that in this statement, or you can flip them around, so it doesn't matter which order you put them in. So my next statement that I wrote down was that AM is congruent to itself, and again, that's by reflexive property. Now I see that I have 3 sides on each triangle that are congruent, so automatically I think, oh yeah, those two triangles have to be congruent to each other by side, side, side. And then again, I'm trying to show that AMB is congruent to AMC, and those are corresponding angles. So my last step would be just writing that, and then I would say, for my reason, CPCTC. So in this lesson, they want to show you corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, the acronym CPCTC. But the other thing is you have to realize that they are proofs, and with proofs you have to practice them by yourself. So I hope you're taking the time during the notes piece that when I say pause the video, you really need to practice that in your brain in order for you to be successful with proofs on the quiz or test. So I hope you're not jumping over that part because it is a very valid point for me to make sure that you're practicing it.